Well, I'm really excited to be here and be talking about this because I'm going to share a little bit of my journey into advocacy around an issue that really fires me up, and am hoping that it's helpful to, as we think about how do we best tell our stories in the experiences that we have in a way that is the most impactful. So I wanted to just get a feel for who was here tonight and ask a couple questions. My first question is whether or not you have an issue or issues that really fires you up, that you're really excited about. Couple people? Awesome. Okay. Then this will totally make sense when you hear my issue and why it came about. If there is an issue that you thought of or can think of, is it because it has affected your life in some way? Is there a personal story that's attached to that issue? So some nods around there. So a lot of times that's why we attach to certain issues is because we've had a personal experience and we want to make a change. We want to see a change in our world. So thinking about reaching out to elected officials, how many of you have contacted an elected official? Whether it's phone or email, letter? Great. Most everyone has contacted some elected official. Has anybody ever testified in front of a committee? Oh, got one. Awesome. I haven't yet. I hope to someday, but I actually went to, this is kind of a funny story, I went to a testimony with my dad who was in the petroleum business in Michigan, and there was this very energetic discussion about how, well, don't gas prices rise on Thursdays? And this is like where his testimony went. It was kind of funny because no, they don't just rise on Thursdays, as you probably know. Also thinking about moving on to voting. Do you or someone that you know have any barriers to voting or accessing polls? Anyone? No? Kind of?
Yeah, I just voted.
Great. That's fantastic. All right. So we're going to discuss some of those. I won't go into them too much, but just so you know where to go for information in case you run into somebody that does have those types of barriers. So I'm going to go through and just talk about, I always like to have like the plan. What are we going to do together tonight? I appreciate you investing your time, and so want to know what I'm hoping you'll walk away with. The first thing is that I want to set the stage, and I'll set the stage a little bit with my personal experience. With the hope of achieving the goals of learning a format for integrating our personal experience into advocacy efforts. We'll then talk about some different methods of engagement that I really didn't know of until I was involved in an advocacy organization. So kind of going on those usual suspects that we talk about a lot. And then we'll direct you to some resources to overcome any barriers to voting. So just gain awareness of where to find those in case you run into somebody that might need them. So that's our plan tonight. So I'm going to start with some fun pictures. And this is my life in 5 pictures. So every person has different reasons for getting involved, and every person has different reasons for the issue that really fires them up. And we learned that a lot of those are personal reasons. So this is me in high school Civinomics in particular. And that was the class, that was our government class. So that was our class when we were talking about all the issues that were going on in 1995 and 96. And I had the remarkable privilege to have a teacher who my grandpa coached. So So came from a long line of coaches, which is probably why I'm attempting not to blast you out of this room, but you have to talk really loud in my family to be heard, so sorry if I am. I try to mind it. But this teacher would always ask my opinion in this class. And I was one of the only people my senior year who was interested in politics. So I always had an opinion. It was usually completely uninformed, no life experience. So I just kind of grab onto something that I thought was the truth, and then I'd run with it. But it was fun because I would have something to share. So in that class, the reason why I was so anxious to share my experience and just be this girl who's like, yes, me, call on me, I've got something, even though, of course he's going to call on me because there's nobody else even raising their hand ever, was because this is what I was dreaming of. So I envisioned being a lobbyist, going to the Capitol, really just getting things done and making policy changes and changing my world, or maybe running for office. And the reason I thought of those two things were that was the only two things I knew as ways to get involved, besides voting and that kind of thing. So those were my two options. But then this happened. And this was life's path taking me in directions that I didn't really anticipate. Those directions included moving to California to fail at being a ski bum, which is an interesting experience. It included being completely out and away from politics, getting back into advocacy work, learning a lot more. And then I think the biggest kind of smack that life's path gave me was this brain, which I started having symptoms of mental illness when I was in my early 20s and was diagnosed with bipolar disorder when I was in my early 30s. And you can see that with bipolar disorder, you have a lot of increased activity, particularly in those areas that are supposed to regulate emotions. And so this was kind of a problem for my life and impacted my functioning quite a bit, my ability to be in the roles that I was in as, an employee, in my relationship, just getting things done at home, in my friendships. And after I went through what I consider to be the defining crisis, where I knew something is really wrong here and I really need help, and I was able to have the remarkable luck of connecting with a therapist and doctor who helped me. I was really committed to working at my recovery. Earlier in my symptoms, I refused to believe that I could possibly have a mental illness, even though I was diagnosed with several other diagnoses upon the path. But I just didn't think. I'm like, no, I definitely do not have a mental illness. When I had the chance to reflect more, after I had stabilized a little bit, after I was, really doing my therapy faithfully and working on myself and, working on my whole treatment plan, then I just got mad. And I got mad at a lot of things. One was that I felt like I had gone through a completely disjointed system of care. So I first was seen 10 years before with my symptoms, and I wasn't diagnosed correctly till 10 years later, which is really, it's a very common experience. So I was mad about that. When I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, my reaction was that I was going to be taken out of that doctor's office in a straitjacket, taken away to some mental institution somewhere, locked up, key thrown away. My thought was, I don't know if I'm going to be able to tell my family where I am. I don't know if I'm going to be able to tell my boyfriend where I am. I was terrified. This was my thought. And I ended up finding NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, because I wanted to do something. And I didn't want somebody else to go through the same experience that I had. So when I started reading more about bipolar disorder, I learned that, this is just how my brain chemistry is, and these are some things that might be a little different in the structure of my brain, and, I can learn all this stuff about it. When I started educating myself, I felt a little bit ashamed of the stigma that I had, and really took that to move me forward in how I got involved in advocacy in a completely different way than I thought that I originally would. So, there's me being mad. I didn't point out that picture. Very mad Courtney right there. So, one of the things we do at NAMI, so NAMI is the nation's largest grassroots mental health organization. And we do a lot of things that really come from the citizen level. We're trying to make policy and systems changes from coming together in this movement. And we use our stories a lot. And a big reason why we use our stories is, in that world, definitely, it's the number one way to reduce stigma. Having contact with a person with mental illness is found by research to be the most effective way to get rid of that pesky stigma, so people hopefully didn't have the reaction that I did when they're diagnosed. It also is a way to have an impact, and hopefully a quick impact, on an elected official that you're trying to talk about on an issue that's important to you. So if you think about this issue that's important to you and how this personal story may relate, we learned a format at NAMI to think about how to lay that out in a way that is brief and still impactful. So I broke it down here, and then I'll share the story that I put together that I share as well to kind of illustrate how this has been an effective tool for me. And then as we're talking about this, if there was that issue that had a relationship to something that's happened in your life, have it in the back of your head and think about, okay, what might this look like? What's my position? What can I talk about that happened? And think about those questions as related to that issue. So in the green print is the introduction. Pretty easy. Name, where you're from, letting, of course, that person know that you're a constituent and that they represent you. We know that that's very important. As much as sometimes I want to call these people all over the state and country and tell them, this is what I think, they actually don't care what I think when they're out in California and I'm in Minnesota, for example. So I've learned that, learning slowly. And talk about how you're impacted. So what I mean by this is, okay, in my world, I'm a person living with mental illness. Maybe somebody with the same concern area could be a family member. They could be somebody that works in the mental health care system and are frustrated by lack of psychiatrists or a lack of psychiatric beds. Or it could be something where, I'm impacted because I had this experience with whatever issue it is. It definitely doesn't have to be mental illness or related to it. And then if there is an ask, which that could be, I need you to support whatever that is, or please don't support whatever that is, that topic area, just stating that position right up front. Sometimes there's not necessarily a an ask. You're just talking to someone and saying, I just want to let you know about my experience because I think it's important to raise awareness about this issue, and I want to be a resource to you. I think the thing that was most surprising to me when I started doing advocacy in a little bit different way is how few contacts a lawmaker actually needs from constituents to kind of perk up their ears and say, oh, this is something that's important to people. This is something that the director of our state NAMI says frequently, that it takes about 4. So if they just hear from 4 people, which to me that blows my mind every time. So the wait part is, or the wait text is what happened. And when we think about a story and what happened to us in our personal experience, we could go on with that forever, right? Especially if it's something that we're really, really emotional about. And all of a sudden we're back here and, I'm talking about what happened to me in kindergarten or whatever, and it has nothing related to what I'm actually asking or trying to do. So the advice here is really to think about what's that most important thing or things. Are there a couple things that are really the turning point that describes what happened in this situation? What helped? What helped? Or sometimes what helped wasn't there. So what would have helped? Had it been in place, what would have helped? Finally, how are you different today? So you the introduction, thinking about what happened, talking about what helped or would have helped, and then now what's going on. So ending on a bit of a positive note, because as we think about, getting to a point and through a difficult situation or through an issue that impacted you greatly and closely, to get to a point where you can even go through this and talk to someone about it is for many of us quite a healing process and journey. So just to recognize, I'm different today because I can talk about it. And I can ask for something that's important to me. Things like that are huge victories that we make when we have these really impactful things that happen in our lives. So a couple other things to think about. And I really like making words by just randomly shoving 2 words together that don't belong together. So askvocate was the one that I came up with. So that's my new word. I'm going to, maybe you'll see it on the new words of 2016 in the list next year, or maybe not. So thinking about then transitioning from the personal story to the overall challenge. So this is my story, this is my experience, what would help people overall? Not just me, but everybody that might be in this situation. And then making the ask. So a lot of times it might be, this is a great time of year for it because, it's an election and there's all these different opportunities to interact with candidates. And even just to ask, can I count on your support of the mental health care system or of investments in veteran services or in more affordable housing for our community? Whatever that issue is, it's a great time to get to know those positions. And also, if that person is elected, you have that relationship. Because another thing that they're doing is, I can't even imagine trying to just manage all of the different information that a lawmaker has to manage in figuring out what to do on these really huge, impactful policies. And who would I even go and turn to? And so thinking about establishing ourselves as a resource for that person is another benefit of sharing the stories. So I just want to talk through the story that has these different parts delineated. And so I will highlight when I'm transitioning to those parts. So my introduction was pretty simple. Hi, I'm Courtney, and a member of NAMI Southeast Minnesota, part of America's largest grassroots mental health organization, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. I live in Northwest Rochester, and I'm also a person living with bipolar disorder that supports protected and expanded mental health funding. So there's my introduction that incorporated, who I am, where I'm from, and what I'm doing there. So what happened, I'm going to go back, so I'm going in this order. So what happened? What is part of my story, I started to struggle with what I would learn to be symptoms of mental illness in my late teens. I felt so much noise in my head and had panic attacks that would leave my chest sore the next day because I gasped so desperately for air. I was soothed by drinking excessively. It was the only thing that calmed my racing thoughts. I had been down before, but in 2010 I had the worst depression I'd ever experienced. Everything was in jeopardy. My job, my relationships, all that I enjoyed. So for me, those were the most important things of my story. I didn't really know what mental illness was. I was doing things to soothe my own symptoms, which are rarely as healthy as working with a professional to do those things. And really talking about, in my life, everything was in jeopardy. So what helped, or what would have helped? I knew I needed help. I was fortunate to connect with a doctor who diagnosed me with bipolar disorder and a great therapist who I saw regularly and still do when I need help. With the support of my family and friends, I stopped drinking and focused on my recovery. So for me, there were things in place that helped, that I want to share with the lawmaker or candidate that I'm talking to. But I wanted to also highlight that I was really fortunate to make those connections. One of the things that I had mentioned before is that I didn't feel that there was a coordination of care, and that's what made me mad and want to advocate for this issue. And so that was something that I thought was really important to highlight about my story. So then, how am I different today? Today, I'm the executive director of NAMI Southeast Minnesota. I share my story often to illustrate recovery is possible. I'm married to my boyfriend at the time I got really sick, and we have 2 beautiful dog babies. I take care of myself and started running in 2014, completing my 3rd marathon in March, something I never thought I could do. So I'm ending here on a positive note, and I'm keeping each section short because I know these people, they're trying to learn about all these things. They don't have a lot of time to hear what's happened to Courtney Lawson since 1978. It's probably a lot of stuff, and a lot of it is probably really boring if you're not Courtney Lawson. So as we go on and think about the need and the problem, so this is where I'm shifting from, okay, this has been my personal experience, and I want to share it with you. And now I'm shifting into how does this apply to everyone, or how can it be made better for everyone? When I look back, I realized I got connected to professionals I liked and trusted due to luck. I got help before I landed in jail because I drove while drunk, before I got hurt because I put myself in dangerous situations, and before I did other things that would destroy everything. So for me, it wasn't the system in place at all. It was luck. It was the ability to know where to go for resources, to know enough about or have enough health literacy to know, okay, well, I need a doctor for this, and I need a therapist for this, and I know what my insurance covers. And so there are a lot of things that happened that I don't think would have happened without that knowledge. So really accounting for the role of luck. What will help others? But it shouldn't depend on luck. Most people don't get the help they need. A strong mental health system will help children and adults get the right care at the right time. And then my ask, and so I keep doing that. So my ask was really, as I have the opportunity to talk to candidates, and so my ask was, if you're elected, can I count on you to protect and expand mental health services? So I really like thinking about the stories in this manner because it keeps it relatively short, because normally you're not breaking it down between each section and you just go through it. And I think this is important, that practice makes perfect. And I know that sometimes when we do a day on the Hill, and sometimes when people get in front of candidates, or get in front of their lawmakers, they get really nervous. Like, oh my gosh, I don't know what to say. My mind is going blank. And especially exposing things about yourself that, in a lot of cases, the issues that affect us and the circumstances that have brought us there are really personal. They're tough to talk about. So I think practicing is a very important part of this story and communicating it. So I think this is important because sometimes the questions that I get are, well, how do I even know what's going on? There's a lot going on. It's hard to keep up on everything. The first thing is, know who those elected officials are. And there's a handy-dandy little type in your address here, and you'll be able to locate those elected officials. And then you can click on each one of their names and get connected to contact information and addresses and email addresses, phone numbers, all that good stuff. Legislative updates. So in my case, there's the issues that I'm really passionate about. Mental health definitely being the top of that list, but there's other things too. And so going to these different advocacy organizations that are doing work on the issues that really fire you up, and signing up for their legislative updates is a great way to just keep up to date on what's going on. And this usually includes some form of action alerts. Has anybody ever responded to an action alert? Yeah. It's super exciting because normally it's like you have 48 hours to call your senator, and here's the number, and this is why, and this is what you can say. And I always get really excited about it because I feel like, I don't know, that time is ticking and I have to talk to them. So responding to those action alerts when you have a chance is really important, because that's how, whatever that issue is, you get that movement of getting those few people that have to respond to contact the people that need to hear it. There usually is a quick turnaround, though, because typically it's when something is in a really critical point. It's going to vote somewhere, it's being heard in a committee, but they need to hear from you ASAP. So I like to talk about the types of advocacy because this was something that was completely unknown to me before I started working for NAMI and doing more grassroots advocacy. So I knew the traditional methods. Traditional methods work. That's why they hang around. So contacting elected officials, whether that's by phone or email or letter, whatever that looks like. I was reading some things just to make sure that I knew what I was talking about, that when they get inundated with those form letters, sometimes those aren't the best way to get attention. So personalizing it is a higher likelihood of it being read. which I realized I was guilty of sometimes when I just really wanted to get something off and I just sent the form letter. It's still something, so that's great. It's something, but if you have a chance to really say, this is how it impacts me, and this is why I care, and I want to be a resource to you, higher likelihood of it getting read via that method. There's a handout packet in the back, and there's some tips for contacting your elected officials. And I think many people in the room have done this, and so I won't go through those, but they're just some good reminders. And one of the ones I just love is about visits. And when you visit a lawmaker and then you go out in the hall maybe and say you're frustrated, don't start complaining until you're in the car, which is really brilliant advice. But I never, you kind of just want to, if you're with somebody, you kind of want to debrief, but don't start complaining until you're in the car. Letters to the editor, another method to get a message out there. And be a voter. Another article in that packet is called Don't Like the Candidates? Vote Anyway. And I think this is something that may be kind of indicative of some elections this year. And it really talks about, it's really fascinating. It talks about how countries with really high voter turnout, some of the strategies that they've used, which some of them you read and the author points out probably won't happen here, but just how do we shift it to create this culture of, we're not going to make people feel bad for not voting, not the guilt trip, but more the, be a voter. What a cool opportunity. Get out, be a voter. And how do we shift that language? And how do we encourage people to vote? Also in that packet is a sheet from the Minnesota Votes website that talks about your rights as a voter. And I think that's really important because a lot of times people aren't really sure what those rights are. And so it just gives some tips for rights as a voter. So that's what's in that packet of information. So what I didn't know is all these different ways to engage that weren't, contacting my elected officials, letters to the editor, voting, those things that I was aware with and had heard about. But being on county boards and commissions, has anybody ever been on a board or commission here? City, county? Awesome. Yeah. I actually just joined the Human Rights Commission for Olmsted County this year, and it's really been interesting. And I know that in several of the commissions and boards, they're looking for volunteers. They're looking for people who want to share information and to share their expertise and to really guide the way that our county and our city is going. And we know there's a lot of things going on in our city and county. So it's really, I'm sure it's always a fun time to be engaged, but since I just started doing it, I really have no frame of reference. So I will say that it's a really fun time to be engaged now. And a great way to get your voice heard. So on the Human Rights Commission, I was really interested in it because mental illness is a disability. It's a hidden disability, but it still falls under that protected category. So I could bring an experience and how different prejudice and discrimination had shaped my life to that commission, which has really been a lot of fun, and just learning about others' experience and hopefully creating a county and city that is more and more inclusive. There are a lot of different initiatives around key areas of concern. Well, I kind of joke around that in the mental health world, at least, just create a work group for it. We just love creating work groups and committees. And a lot of times it's all these people that are in the field or in that work, but it's not the people who are necessarily accessing services or who are really struggling to get those services, maybe facing a lot of barriers. So it's not so much those folks, and that's exactly who needs to be part of those conversations. So there's different ways to find out about these. A couple things just to highlight now is the Community Health Improvement Plan, which there was just a press release. I think it came out, I don't know, all my days are going together, maybe late last week, with the priorities that were identified by the community for the top health needs. Well, around that, there are different groups who are trying to impact those different priorities. Great way to get involved if there's something health related that you're interested in that aligns with those priorities. There are groups that are looking at housing and transportation and all these different community things that if that is an issue that is important to you or that you want to weigh in on, great opportunities to do so. And I think that a lot of times hearing those stories is so impactful because we know, I'll just give an example of transportation, we know from second and third hand knowledge that people can't get to work when they work second or third shift because the buses aren't running and if they don't have their own transportation. But to actually have somebody stand up and say, this is how this affects my life, and to weigh into that discussion is just an enormous way, I think, to do advocacy as just a citizen. So I think there's lots of opportunities there. Are there other ideas, non-traditional ways that anybody's gotten involved in the past that you can think of?
Also church groups.
Awesome! Church group, yeah.
United Methodist Church for years and years and years, as long as I know. We have advocated for, clean water. We have advocated for, many, many different, for the rights of children, and that's ongoing. And there's a lot of work done, and there's also lobbying done, and on states, in the different states, but also in Washington D.C. too. So.
Great. Very neat. Yeah, churches do so much and usually have, like you mentioned, like such a variety of different interests and different ways that they're helping out locally, regionally, nationally, and around the world. So that's great. So 35 days to get your sticker. You just have to wait. Well, you can vote absentee and get it sooner, but these stickers, I mean, they're really kind of coveted, aren't they? Like, when you get your sticker, everybody wears their sticker, proudly. At least I noticed that. So, you want your sticker, right? So, knowing your rights. This website, mnvotes.org, is incredible for it connects to the Secretary of State's election and voting page, and it has a variety of downloadable fact sheets that addresses some of those tricky questions that there's a lot of misconceptions out there about. So one example that we get, or a couple examples that we get, is for people that have a felony on their record and whether or not they can vote. And they actually can vote, can register to vote and vote if they have served their sentence and they're not on probation or parole. So things like that really come up frequently, especially since there can be a link between mental illnesses that aren't controlled and maybe doing something that you wished you hadn't a little bit later when they are controlled. I can think of several examples that it could have gone that way in my life if I was not as lucky as I was. But that's one that we run into. Guardianship is another thing. Sometimes if somebody is under guardianship and think, oh, I'm under guardianship and I can't vote, unless that right was specifically taken away, then they can. So all those fact sheets, all the information on that website, really fantastic. And you can also print a sample ballot, which I always think is helpful because I don't know if anybody's had the experience where you're in the voting booth and you're going through and you have your key races and you're really trucking along and then you get to something and you're like, oh, I didn't even know this was me and I don't even know either one of these people and so I think getting a sample ballot ahead of time, you type in your address and you can get that. And you can actually, one of your rights is to take that sample ballot into the voting booth with you, which I think is just, it's great, especially if I didn't quite remember or I don't know, maybe I'm rushed or whatever to have that done. Now there is absentee ballots available and in-person absentee voting, which we were talking about is at the same building where the incident happened yesterday with the Olmsted County employee, which is horrible. And but it is in that same building, which I don't think is, I'm sure it will be secure and everything, but just wanted to point that out. And then they do have some Saturday hours in November for people to vote. So you can vote absentee up until the day before the election, so November 7th. And, okay, so,
I have a question.
yeah.
Do you have the research on or know how to contact to find out more about the justices? In the election, when we vote, there is so often, a judge and that one area that is often, I presume it always comes up in one of the issues in the newspaper, but a lot of times I've missed it and then I have no clue and it really gets me upset.
That's a great question. Yeah, thank you for...
Do you have the information how to get that?
I don't have anything more direct than I've gotten it just when they do their profiles in the paper before. Because you're talking local, is that correct? Local?
Yeah, Minnesota,
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Do you have...
If you're comfortable doing the internet, if you do see the names that are on there, you can usually just search and find stories on them. Because I find the same problem, that you just don't know who you vote for, if you shouldn't. But that way, because I use that same site there.
Yeah, thank you for that, because that's a tough one. Just getting the information. And has anyone used any of the voter selection tools that are out there? I know a lot of the newspapers do them. NPR does one. NPR does them. That's an interesting, you can choose which, it'll give you some different viewpoints and you choose which one most closely aligns with your viewpoint and it'll give you different scores essentially and who you align with the most. It's just I think what's most helpful for me with that is I kind of know which way I'll probably end up, but just to learn, oh wow, I didn't know that I had so much in common here and maybe I need to learn a lot more about this other party or this other candidate. So also something to check out if you're comfortable with the internet. I know the New York Times has one that I've used before. NPR has a great one as well.
What's it called?
Their candidate selection tools. It's usually so the thing is with that is it's for bigger races. So in the state, they'll typically do like state legislators. and then the federal races. But then a lot of the newspapers, bigger newspapers, will do the federal races as well. So just some great information there that's helpful to learn. All right, well, I wanted to share some resources with you too, and I think I mentioned that site, the Minnesota MN Votes, but also the Who Represents Me, and then I just shared our website and contact information in case you have questions for me or have any interest in learning more about mental health and mental illness. Yeah.
When you were talking about your advocacy, one of the things that surprised me was that you didn't mention having any statistics in your toolbox when you went to talk to legislators. I can understand the importance of a personal story, but I also think that needs to be supported by, there are a lot more of us out here than you realize.
Great point. Thank you for that. I think the numbers are really important, and I think I'm glad you said that, because a lot of times when I've had the opportunity to talk about my personal story have been at things where I've had something, a fact sheet or something, so I completely overlooked that. But yeah, those statistics they're huge. And also the economic impact is another thing. So numbers, but then also I think I'm just thinking about mental health, mental illness in particular. If we can intervene here and help out with crisis response, for example, and then we avoid an inpatient hospitalization, that saves thousands of dollars. So, yeah, that's a great point.
Because then you don't really have to waste your time. I mean, you can pick some highlights, but something you can leave with that.
Those leave behinds are, and the fact sheets too. It just really, I think sometimes I've just had to, if it's another issue that I'm not as familiar with, but still, it's still something that I get excited about. Usually finding those advocacy organizations online, a lot of times they have some type of fact sheet, and then it's coming from, somewhere legit and not weird things on the internet. Yeah.
Is NAMI putting any pressure on insurance companies for inpatient care? It seems like, in our experience, 28 days in your home. When you get a heart attack, you could be there for 6 months, and insurance companies wouldn't say cool about that. You'd be inpatient or whatever, and 28 days you get kicked out. So are you guys putting any pressure?
So thanks for that question, because that is it's actually a legislative priority going into the next session. I don't know, and I don't want to take us too far off track, but I do want to speak to that because I think it's important. So mental health parity is the law that says mental health services have to be covered the same as physical health services. With that law, the thing that's hard about it is there's a couple of things. One is that it doesn't apply to every plan. So a plan has to meet certain qualifications to even be subject to parity, size, type of plan. It also means that you don't get good coverage necessarily, because if your coverage for a physical illness, like if you have a heart attack, if that's not great, then parity for mental health care is not going to be great either. So it doesn't necessarily result in good/better care. However, one of the priorities both for NAMI statewide and federally is to expand and enforce parity. So a lot of what's happening now, even in plans that are subject to parity, sometimes they're just not doing it. and nothing's really happening to those plans. And so where NAMI's position is really putting the pressure on to, okay, more plans need to be covered by this parity law, and then we need to enforce it, and we need to put pressure on to enforce it. One resource that is really helpful is there's a section on the NAMI site that's dedicated to parity. It's just nami.org/parity. It gives some characteristics of when parity may have been violated and asks for stories